Chapter 1: The Neighbor's House and Halloween Night. My name is Nathan Scott, I'm 17 years old, and last year, I made the biggest mistake of my life. It happened on Halloween night, when my friends and I decided it was time to face our childhood fears and prove to ourselves that we were grown-ups. In our small Pennsylvania town, there's one legend everyone knows, the house on Willow Street. It's an enormous, old mansion built back in the 19th century, and it's always been abandoned. Its peeling facade, faded wooden panels, and shattered windows created the perfect setting for horror stories. Every kid in town was too scared to even walk past it. The house belonged to the Grayson family, who mysteriously disappeared over 50 years ago. Local rumors claimed that Mr. Grayson, the homeowner, was an occultist who performed rituals in the basement. Others said their twin daughter brought about the curse. Either way, the house earned the title, Cursed, and no one dared to step foot inside. This year, Halloween landed on a Friday, and my friends Jamie, Liam, and I decided to do something special. We created a challenge: sneak into the house on Willow Street and stay there for an hour. It was supposed to be our baptism of courage. Are you sure this is a good idea? Liam asked as we sat in my garage discussing the plan. Why not? It's just a house. Besides, we're not sleeping there, we're just going in, looking around, and leaving, I said, trying to mask my own fear. Jamie just grinned. He was always the most reckless of us. Nathan's right. We're not kids anymore. Aren't you curious to see what's inside? Liam hesitated but eventually agreed. We decided to meet at 10 p.m. when the streets would be quiet after the night's trick-or-treating. At 10 o'clock, I stood in front of the house with a flashlight in hand. Jamie and Liam were already waiting. The house looked even creepier under the moonlight. Its slanted roof cast a long shadow over the weed-choked yard, and it seemed like someone was watching us from the shattered windows. Well, ready? Jamie said, gripping a baseball bat he'd brought, just in case. No, but we're going in anyway, Liam muttered. The old wooden gate creaked as we pushed it open. It felt like we were crossing some invisible threshold. The front door was closed but not locked. When Jamie gave it a push, it opened with a groan, revealing a dark hallway. The smell of old wood and dust hit us, and I instinctively stepped back. Come on, guys, it's just a house, I said, trying to rally us. The hallway was long and shadowy. Our flashlights illuminated peeling wallpaper, cracked picture frames, and doors leading to other rooms. We walked in silence, each of us trying not to show our fear. In the first room, we found an old dining table. On it sat an empty candelabra, and the chairs around it were overturned. Do you feel that? Liam whispered, glancing around nervously. Feel what? I asked. It's cold. Way too cold for an empty house, he replied. I felt it too. The air was icy, as if someone had cranked the AC to full blast, even though the house clearly had no power. Suddenly, from upstairs, we heard a dull thud, like furniture being moved. We froze. It's just the wind, I said unconvincingly. Wind doesn't move furniture, Jamie replied, his usual confidence shaken. We decided to go upstairs. The stairs creaked under our feet like something out of a horror movie. On the second floor, the hallway was even darker. In one of the rooms, we saw something that made me question my sanity. On the floor was a circle drawn in chalk, filled with strange symbols. Inside the circle was a doll, old, with a porcelain face and a tattered dress. Its head was tilted toward us. What the hell is that? Liam whispered, stepping back. Jamie leaned in for a closer look. It's a prank, he said. Someone's trying to scare us. but I didn't think it was a joke. The doll seemed alive. Its glass eyes appeared to follow us. "We should leave," I said, feeling fear swell inside me. But Jamie didn't listen. He reached out to touch the doll, and as soon as he did, the house trembled, as if struck by a massive force. From deep within the house, a voice emerged. It was low, drawn out, and filled the air like a sinister whisper. "You've made a mistake." Chapter 2: The Voice in the Darkness. The moment we heard the whisper, every instinct in my body screamed at me to run for the door and never look back. But my legs felt glued to the floor. The whisper came from all directions at once, as though the house itself was speaking to us. Jamie jerked his hand away from the doll as if it had burned him. Liam clutched my arm in terror, and I struggled to make out the words in the jumble of eerie sounds. "We have to leave," I finally managed to say, my voice hoarse, as if I'd been underwater. "Agreed," Liam said quickly. Jamie, usually fearless, looked shaken but nodded. "Okay. Let's get out of here." We backed away toward the stairs, avoiding looking at the doll, which seemed to be staring at us with its unblinking glass eyes. Just as we reached the top step, there was a deafening crash. The door behind us slammed shut with such force that the windows rattled. Liam screamed, a sound filled with raw, unfiltered fear. We all froze, staring at the door that had been open only seconds ago. It now looked as though it had never existed. "How is this even possible?" I whispered, more to myself than to the others. Jamie turned to us, his face pale as chalk. It's the house. It's playing with us," he said, glancing at the walls, which now seemed taller and darker than before. "We need to find a way out," I said, forcing myself to sound calm. We rushed downstairs toward the front door. I remembered that it hadn't been locked when we entered. But when we reached it, the door was no longer the same. It was covered in cracked, rusted metal. Jamie grabbed the handle and pulled with all his strength, but it didn't budge. "It won't open," he shouted, slamming his fist against the door. "How is this even possible? We just got here." Liam's voice was cracking with panic. I tried as well, yanking on the handle and ramming my shoulder into the door, but it didn't even move. It was as if the door had fused with the wall. Then the voice returned. This time, it was louder, clearer, and I could make out the words. "You were never meant to enter." We bolted in the opposite direction, looking for a window or a back door. But the windows, which had been visible from the outside, were now dark and opaque, like dead eyes. We found a door that I remembered leading to the kitchen and threw it open. The kitchen was empty, except for an old wooden table. Sitting in the center of the table was another doll. It was identical to the one we'd seen upstairs, with the same cracked porcelain face and torn dress. Its head was tilted at the same unsettling angle, and its arms were stretched out, almost as if it was waiting for us. "No. Nope. Absolutely not," Liam stammered, stepping backward. Jamie grabbed a chair and hurled it at the doll. The chair flew through the air, and passed right through the doll as if it weren't there at all. "What the hell?" Jamie shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. I suddenly noticed that the temperature in the room had dropped sharply. My breath became visible in the cold air, and an icy chill seeped into my bones. And then, the kitchen door slammed shut behind us. We sprinted back into the hallway, but now every door leading to the other rooms began to shake violently, as though something inside was trying to get out. From each room came a chorus of screams. "We have to find the basement," Jamie yelled. "The basement? Are you insane? We don't even know what's down there," Liam shouted back. "But we know what's up here, and I don't like it." Jamie charged ahead, and we had no choice but to follow. The stairs to the basement looked different than they had earlier. The walls were covered in dark stains, and the wooden banister seemed rotten. But we had no other options. As we descended, I realized the basement had somehow expanded. It was much larger than it had been when we first peeked in. At the far end of the room were 3 old doors. Each one was different. One was made of dark wood, another was metallic, and the third was covered in faded, tattered fabric. "Which one leads to the exit?" Liam asked, his voice shaking. "There's no guarantee any of them do," Jamie replied, gripping his baseball bat tightly. And then the doll we'd seen before appeared again, now standing in the middle of the room. Its glassy eyes slowly turned toward us, and a faint whisper came from its small porcelain lips. "You've chosen the wrong path." Chapter 3: The 3 Doors. We stood in the dark basement, consumed by the oppressive feeling that the house itself was forcing us to make a choice. Before us were 3 doors, and the doll in the center of the room, like some sinister sentinel, stared at us with its lifeless glass eyes. Jamie, always the most decisive among us, was the first to speak. "We can't stay here forever. If we don't move, something will definitely come for us. And what if what's behind those doors is worse than this?" Liam asked, gripping his flashlight like it was a weapon. "We don't know," I said, my voice barely audible. "But staying here isn't an option either." The doors felt symbolic, each one representing a different kind of fear. The wooden door seemed familiar but ominous, like a memory you'd rather forget. The metal door was foreboding, as though something powerful and hostile waited behind it. The fabric-covered door was the strangest, appearing fragile and aged, as though it concealed something incomprehensible. "We go through the wooden one," Jamie said with authority. "It feels the least dangerous." He pushed it open, and it creaked loudly, revealing a long corridor. The walls were peeling, with faded paint flaking off in strips. The floor was made of rotting planks that creaked with every step. "Perfect," Liam muttered nervously, wiping sweat from his brow. "It looks like a haunted house set for a horror movie." We moved cautiously, our footsteps echoing unnaturally loudly in the corridor. The beam of my flashlight barely penetrated the darkness ahead, but the shadows seemed to grow and shift behind us. Suddenly, the sound beneath our feet changed. The decayed wooden boards groaned ominously, and then... "Careful!" I yelled as the floor beneath Jamie gave way. He almost plummeted through the gaping hole, but Liam and I grabbed his arms just in time and pulled him back to safety. "Thanks," Jamie gasped, his face pale. We peered into the darkness below the broken floor. It wasn't just a crawl space or a void. It was an abyss, and from it came a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, a chorus of voices that sent chills down my spine. "We should turn back," Liam said, his voice trembling. "No," Jamie said firmly, standing up. "We've come too far to turn back now." Reluctantly, we pressed on. The corridor seemed endless, and each step brought more unease. The smell of decay and something metallic filled the air, growing stronger the farther we went. At last, the corridor ended in a room. It was small, with a low ceiling and a massive wooden table in the center. On the table lay a single object, an ancient book. Its cover looked like it was made of worn leather, and the yellowed pages were filled with strange symbols. "What is that?" I asked, stepping closer. "Are you seriously thinking of touching it?" Liam asked, staying as far back as possible. "What if it's a clue?" I replied, though doubt crept into my voice. Jamie reached out and opened the book. The pages were covered in text written in an unfamiliar language. On one page, however, there was a drawing, 3 figures standing before 3 doors, just like the ones we had seen. Their faces were blurry, and their forms seemed distorted, almost wrong. "That's us," Liam whispered, his voice shaking. Before we could discuss it further, the door we had entered through slammed shut behind us. We ran to it, but it wouldn't budge. The temperature in the room plummeted, and we could see our breath in the cold air. Then came the sound we all dreaded, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and echoing from somewhere below the floor. "There's something under us," Liam screamed. The footsteps grew louder, closer, then stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. Suddenly, the book on the table began to vibrate. Then, impossibly, it started to speak. "You have made your choice," it said in a guttural, disembodied voice. "Now the walls are watching." Words began to scrawl themselves across the pages as if written by an invisible hand. Jamie slammed the book shut, but it seemed fused to the table. Then, from the far wall of the room, a shadow began to emerge. At first, it was just a faint outline, but slowly it took shape. It was humanoid but grotesquely stretched, its eyes empty and its mouth unnaturally wide. "Get out of here!" I yelled. We rushed back to where the door had been, but the wall now gave way like fabric. We stumbled through it and found ourselves back in the basement. But it wasn't the same basement. The walls were covered in glowing symbols, pulsating with a sickly green light. In the center of the room stood the doll once more. "It moved," Liam said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jamie didn't hesitate this time. He swung his baseball bat with all his might, aiming for the doll. But just as the bat made contact, the doll let out a laugh. It wasn't a child's laugh, it was deep, guttural, and echoed unnaturally, making our hearts pound. "We never should have come here," I said, my voice quivering as the doll raised its porcelain hand and pointed at the second door, the metal one. Next, a voice from the shadows intoned. Chapter 4, The Door of Steel. We stood frozen, staring at the doll as it pointed toward the metal door. Its lifeless, glassy eyes seemed to follow us as though daring us to take the next step. "It's a trap," Liam whispered, his voice shaky as his gaze darted between the doll and the metal door. "Of course it's a trap," I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. "But staying here isn't any safer." Jamie tightened his grip on the bat, his knuckles turning white. "We don't have a choice," he said. "If we stay, this thing," he gestured toward the doll, "will keep playing with us." The metal door loomed before us, its surface tarnished and covered with rust. From underneath, a black mist seeped out, curling like smoke. I hesitated, inhaling deeply to steady myself, before grabbing the cold, rough handle and pulling it open. The door groaned as it swung inward, revealing a spiraling passageway that descended deep into the earth. The walls were damp, and the smell of rot and decay wafted up to meet us. "What is this?" Liam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's only one way to find out," Jamie said, stepping inside. The spiral descent. The passageway was claustrophobically narrow, forcing us to walk single file. The air grew heavier with every step, filled with a sickly mix of mildew and something metallic. The beam of my flashlight illuminated just a few feet ahead, but the darkness beyond seemed almost alive, devouring the light. "Don't look back," I said quietly. "Why not?" Liam asked, his voice trembling. "Just don't," I replied. Even I didn't know why I said it, but something in my gut warned me not to tempt the darkness. The farther we descended, the louder the sounds around us became. At first, it was the faint dripping of water. Then, a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Finally, the spiraling passage ended, opening into a cavernous room. Our flashlights revealed slimy, glistening walls and pools of stagnant water scattered across the floor. In the center of the room was a massive iron cage, its bars bent and rusted. "What the hell is this place?" Liam whispered, edging closer to me. Jamie shone his flashlight inside the cage. There was nothing there, at least, nothing visible. But then we heard it. A scraping sound echoed from the far corner of the room. It was slow and deliberate, like claws dragging across stone. What was that? Liam's voice was on the verge of panic. "Stay calm," Jamie said, though even he sounded unsure. I swung my flashlight toward the noise, and that's when we saw it, a hulking, grotesque figure emerging from the shadows. It had elongated limbs and pale, slimy skin that seemed to glisten in the dim light. Its face was featureless, except for its gaping mouth, filled with rows of jagged teeth. "Run!" Jamie yelled, raising his bat as if to defend us. The creature moved faster than anything that size should have been able to. Its long arms clawed at the ground as it lunged toward us. We bolted back up the spiral passage, our footsteps echoing wildly. The creature's guttural growl reverberated around us, growing louder with every second. "It's gaining on us," Liam shouted, his voice breaking. Jamie turned and swung the bat at the creature, landing a hit on one of its arms. It let out an ear-piercing screech, but it didn't stop. Instead, it reared back, its massive frame blocking the passage behind us. "Go!" Jamie yelled, swinging again. "I'll hold it off." "No!" I screamed, grabbing his arm. "We stick together." We stumbled back into the room where the spiral began, slamming a heavy wooden door behind us. Liam threw his weight against it, and I wedged a nearby piece of debris under the handle to keep it shut. The creature's roars echoed on the other side, but for now, the door held. The mirror room. The room we found ourselves in was unlike anything we'd seen before. Its walls were covered with mirrors, all of them slightly cracked and warped. Our reflections stared back at us, distorted and wrong. "This can't be real," Liam muttered, his voice barely audible. In the center of the room was a small pedestal with an ornate, antique music box sitting on top of it. Its brass surface gleamed under the harsh beam of my flashlight. Jamie stepped forward cautiously. "It's like it's waiting for us." "Don't touch it," I warned. But before I could stop him, Jamie turned the handle. The music box began to play a haunting, disjointed melody. The room seemed to shift as the music echoed, and the mirrors came alive. Our reflections moved, but they didn't mimic our actions. Instead, they turned to face us, their expressions blank. Slowly, they began to smile, wide, unnatural grins that stretched far beyond what should have been possible. "This isn't real. This isn't real," Liam repeated, backing into a corner. The music stopped abruptly, and the mirrors shattered. Shards of glass rained down, forcing us to shield our faces. When I looked back up, the walls were no longer mirrors. They were covered in symbols, the same glowing green runes we'd seen earlier. In the center of the room, the doll reappeared. Its porcelain face was cracked now, and its glass eyes had turned a deep, blood red. It raised one tiny hand and pointed toward the last door, a fabric-covered portal that seemed to writhe as though it were alive. "No," Liam whispered. "We're not going in there." "We don't have a choice," Jamie said, his voice filled with grim determination. "Do you ever stop being so reckless?" I snapped, but even as I said it, I knew he was right. The doll's head tilted, and its cracked lips parted. "Your time is running out," it said in a voice that sounded like a chorus of whispers. Chapter 5, The Living Fabric. The last door stood before us, its surface covered in tattered black fabric that seemed to ripple like it was breathing. It pulsed faintly, as though it were alive. "I can't," Liam said, backing away. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he clutched his flashlight. "I can't go through there." Jamie stepped forward, gripping his bat tightly. "We don't have a choice. If we stay, this house will keep playing with us until—" He didn't finish the sentence, but we all knew how it ended. I took a deep breath, forcing down the rising panic in my chest. "We go together. No one gets left behind." With that, I grabbed the fabric-covered handle and pulled the door open. The fabric hallway. Behind the door was a hallway unlike anything I'd ever seen. The walls were made of the same black fabric, pulsating with an almost imperceptible rhythm. The floor was soft beneath our feet, and every step sent a faint ripple through the material, like walking on a waterbed. "It's alive," Liam whispered, his voice barely audible. The air was thick and warm, carrying a faint metallic scent that made me feel like I was suffocating. I tried to focus on the flashlight beam ahead, ignoring the way the walls seemed to close in with every step. "We need to keep moving," Jamie said, his voice steady, though his grip on the bat betrayed his fear. As we ventured deeper, the hallway began to shift. The walls quivered, and faint shapes moved beneath the fabric, pressing outward as though something on the other side was trying to break through. "Do you see that?" Liam asked, his voice shaking. "Yeah," I said, unable to look away. The shapes grew more defined, hands pressing against the walls, their fingers clawing at the material. Faces appeared next, distorted and screaming silently, their mouths stretched wide in anguish. "Don't stop," Jamie urged. The hallway began to narrow, forcing us to walk single file. The pulsating rhythm of the walls grew faster, and the fabric became warm to the touch, almost burning. Ahead, the hallway split into 3 paths. "You've got to be kidding me," Liam groaned, glancing at me. "Which way?" Jamie asked, his voice tense. Before I could answer, the walls began to tremble violently, and the faces pressed harder against the fabric. A deep, guttural moan echoed through the hallway, followed by a sharp ripping sound. The fabric tore, and from the gashes emerged grotesque figures. Their bodies were twisted and malformed, with elongated limbs and eyeless faces. They moved unnaturally, their jerky motions defying logic. "Run!" I shouted. We sprinted down the middle path, the creatures clawing at the walls as they pursued us. The floor beneath us seemed to shift, making it harder to keep our balance. Liam tripped, falling hard onto the soft, rippling surface. I turned back, grabbing his arm and pulling him to his feet just as one of the creatures reached out for him. Its clawed hand scraped against his leg, tearing through his jeans and leaving a shallow cut. "Keep going," Jamie yelled from ahead. The hallway twisted and turned, disorienting us. The creature's guttural groans echoed behind us, growing louder. Finally, we reached another door, this one made entirely of the same black fabric. Without hesitation, Jamie slammed his shoulder into it, and the door burst open, sending us tumbling into the next room. The Chamber of Strings. The door slammed shut behind us, and the creature's moans faded. We were in a large, circular chamber. The walls were lined with strings, thousands of thin, glistening threads stretching from floor to ceiling. They vibrated faintly, emitting a haunting hum that resonated deep in my chest. "What is this place?" Liam asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, glancing around nervously. In the center of the room stood a massive loom, ancient and covered in dust. On it, a half-finished tapestry hung, depicting scenes that sent chills down my spine. The first panel showed 3 figures standing before a dark house, us, I realized. The second panel showed the same figures inside the house, surrounded by shadows. The final panel was incomplete, but it showed 3 figures tangled in strings, their faces twisted in agony. "It's us," Jamie said, his voice barely above a whisper. Before we could react, the strings on the walls began to move. They twisted and stretched, reaching toward us like living tendrils. "Get back!" I shouted, swiping at the strings with my flashlight. The light didn't stop them. The strings wrapped around Jamie's arm, pulling him toward the loom. "Help me!" he screamed, thrashing wildly. Liam and I grabbed him, pulling with all our strength. The strings were strong, their grip unyielding, but we managed to free him. "We need to get out of here," Liam shouted. I turned toward the loom, and that's when I saw it, a pair of scissors lying on the floor nearby, old and rusted but sharp enough to cut the strings. "Cover me," I yelled, darting toward the scissors. The strings lunged at me, wrapping around my legs and arms. I struggled, reaching for the scissors as they pulled me closer to the loom. My fingers closed around the handle, and with a desperate swing, I severed the strings. The room shook violently, and the strings recoiled, writhing like wounded snakes. "Go, now," I shouted. We ran toward another door that had appeared at the far end of the chamber. It was smaller than the others, made of plain wood, and seemed completely out of place in this nightmare. Jamie pushed it open, and we stepped through. The endless staircase. The door led to a spiraling staircase that ascended into darkness. We hesitated only briefly before starting to climb, our footsteps echoing on the stone steps. "This has to lead somewhere," Jamie said, though he didn't sound convinced. The higher we climbed, the harder it became to breathe. The air grew thin and cold, and a low whisper began to fill the stairwell. "You shouldn't have come," the voice said, faint but unmistakable. "What do you want from us?" I yelled, but there was no answer. The staircase seemed endless, but at last, we reached the top. Another door stood before us, this one marked with a single word carved into the wood. "Exit." "Is it real?" Liam asked, his voice shaking. "It has to be," Jamie said. Without hesitation, he opened the door, and we stepped through. Chapter 6, The Exit. The door creaked open, and we stumbled through it into a blinding white light. For a moment, I couldn't see anything, but as my vision adjusted, the light dimmed, revealing the living room of the house. "No," Liam whispered, his voice cracking. "This can't be right. We were just—" "It's not real," Jamie cut him off, spinning in place, his bat held tightly in his hands. "This house is screwing with us. It's another trick." I stepped forward, looking around. Everything was as we'd first found it, the dusty furniture, the cracked wallpaper, the smell of decay lingering in the air. But something was wrong. "Look," I said, pointing at the clock on the mantel. The hands weren't moving. They were stuck at midnight. Jamie ran to the front door and grabbed the handle. To our surprise, it turned easily, and the door swung open to reveal the cool night outside. "Guys, we're out," he said, glancing back at us. Liam and I exchanged a look. It seemed too good to be true, but the fresh air wafting through the open door was too tempting to resist. We stepped outside, the gravel crunching under our feet. The house loomed behind us, dark and silent. It no longer seemed alive, but the oppressive weight of its presence remained heavy on my chest. "We did it," Liam said, letting out a shaky laugh. "We actually made it." But as we started to walk away, something stopped me. I turned back to the house and froze. In one of the upstairs windows, a shadowy figure stood watching us. "Do you see that?" I whispered. Jamie and Liam turned to look, but the figure was gone. "It's nothing," Jamie said, though his voice wavered. "Come on. Let's get the hell out of here." The aftermath. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the house, its dark windows staring back at me. I heard the whispers, the guttural growls, the laughter of the doll. Liam was worse. He stopped coming to school, and when I finally visited him, his house was dark, the curtains drawn. When he opened the door, his face was gaunt, and his eyes darted around like he expected something to leap out at him. "They're still here," he whispered, pulling me inside. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew. "They followed us," he said, his voice trembling. "I see them in the shadows. I hear them at night." Jamie, on the other hand, acted like nothing had happened. He told anyone who asked that it was all a prank, a Halloween stunt that we'd planned to scare ourselves. But I could see it in his eyes, he didn't believe his own lies. The final return. A month later, I received a text from Jamie. "We need to go back." I stared at my phone, my heart racing. "What are you talking about?" "Why?" I replied. He didn't respond right away. When he finally did, his message was simple. "It's not over." Against my better judgment, I agreed. Liam refused to come, begging me not to go, but something inside me knew Jamie was right. We met outside the house at midnight. It looked the same as before, dark, abandoned, and somehow alive. "I've been hearing it," Jamie said, his voice low. "The whispers. The footsteps. It's like the house isn't done with us." "Then why go back?" I asked, gripping the flashlight in my hand. "Because if we don't, it'll never let us go," he said. The truth revealed. We stepped through the front door, and the house seemed to greet us. The air was heavy, the walls groaned, and the smell of decay was stronger than ever. The living room was unchanged, but something drew us to the basement. As we descended the stairs, the walls seemed to pulse, like the house was alive and breathing. In the center of the basement, the 3 doors were gone. Instead, there was only a single, massive door made of black stone, with glowing red symbols etched into its surface. "This is it," Jamie said. The door opened on its own, revealing a room bathed in dim red light. At its center was a massive stone altar, and on it lay a book, the same book we'd seen before. "This is where it started," Jamie said, stepping forward. As he approached the altar, the whispers began again, louder and clearer than before. "You were warned," the voices said, echoing around us. Jamie reached for the book, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I said. "It's the only way," he replied, shaking me off. When he touched the book, the room trembled. The walls began to close in, and the red light grew blinding. "Jamie, let's go," I shouted, but he didn't move. The whispers became a roar, and suddenly Jamie was lifted off the ground, his body suspended above the altar. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, pulsing in time with his screams. I ran forward, trying to pull him down, but an invisible force knocked me back. The last thing I saw before the light consumed the room was Jamie's face, contorted in agony. The escape. I woke up outside, lying in the overgrown yard of the house. The sun was rising, casting its warm light over the decrepit structure. Jamie was gone. I ran to the door, but it was sealed shut, the windows dark and empty. I don't know how I got out or why the house let me go. But every night since then, I've heard the whispers. They remind me of Jamie's last words as he reached for the book. "It's the only way." I don't know what he meant, but I fear I'll have to find out one day. Because the house on Willow Street isn't done with me. Not yet.